Hey everybody, this is Perch. This is probably a sillier video, but it's I've used this analogy now a few times in for a few different subjects, and it keeps coming up. And a couple of people have pointed out that there are actually a lot of similarities between these two industries, and so I thought I'd just very in almost a lighthearted way, dig into that a little bit. So, what are these two industries we're talking about? It's the comic book industry, of course. That's what this channel is in theory, and the wrestling industry. So could there's I've mentioned this, by the way. I've rolled this out at Comics Pro before. I've done it when I'm out for drinks, and like 9 times out of 10, I get a blank stare, and then just like I don't know what this guy is talking about, and people move on. They just don't they don't see the two, and because of course you've got sequential art and stories and something that is distributed through a printer and everything else, and then you have this sports entertainment business is completely different. How who in their right mind would say there's any similarities between how these two business operate? But there are quite a few in this very weird way. It is where the one person out of 10 is like, yeah, I know where you're going with this. Yes, you are right. So what what possible connections could these two have? Well, let's start with a really obvious one, in that the group or the people who work in comics, the people who work within wrestling, the creators or the performers, whatever that happens to be, they tend to operate in a pretty tight knit, closed circle. They tend to have their own little universe with their own little rules and their own little networks and their own little groups of cliques that they hang with, and so on. And they will often help each other, help these groups out at the detriment sometimes of the company itself or other groups, whatever it is, to kind of gain position and power. And you've seen that over the years, in certainly in wrestling, with I mean just various things. The one that always tends to come into mind when people talk about this is the Scott Hall, Kevin Nash kind of group that would go on with Sean Waltman and Shawn Michaels, and kind of that little group of performers that would frequently, work to each other. The other thing, though, that is true about wrestling is that when somebody stumbles and it's there's no way to kind of cure it, there's no way to hide the problem, then that person becomes a weird pariah. It's like once you buck the system, once you expose some flaw in the business, or once you reveal something that maybe you reveal too much of the inner workings. It's, by the way, a little bit. We'll see how it all goes, because there's plenty of people jumping to his defense at the moment. It's a little bit how the Dan Slott situation seems to be evolving, where a number of other creators are kind of fed up with him, but not necessarily for the reasons you think. They're fed up with him because he's talking about how other writers use ghost writers and how he wouldn't do that. And there's aspects of what Dan Slott is doing right now that feels like he's exposing the business, much to the disagreement and dislike of some of his peers. And so you see this in wrestling as well, where somebody will, maybe give an incorrect comment to one of the dirt sheets, or somebody else, and you'll see like their peers suddenly they'll become a pariah. Like nobody wants to talk or travel with them, and it just becomes this flee the scene kind of behavior, even to people that were formerly really kind of well established. Uh, Not to get too much into the dark aspect of it, but both wrestling and the comics industry also has its more than its fair share of pretty ugly forms of sexual harassment and other things that have gone on, where the people who work in the business tend to circle the wagons and deny any indication that this is going on, until it becomes just impossible to do so. And then you kind of tip into what I said earlier, that suddenly that person becomes a pariah. They're kicked out. There's a lot of fingers that are pointed, but the actual core behavior tends to still happen. And that's a little bit, if you look at what happened and what went down with Warren Ellis earlier in the year, you saw kind of a bunch of people within the industry kind of speak out against it, and how dare he? It's just very kind of outraged responses to Warren Ellis's behavior. But, and I don't think this is coming as a big surprise to anybody, a lot of what Ellis was doing is still plenty rampant within the comic industry. Maybe a little less now because nobody can leave their homes, but I think everybody, and I've talked to dozens of people who believe that when the convention season starts up again, that first comic convention, like somebody's going to leave there in a body bag because people are just going to go there and they're just not going to be in control, and it's like the floodgates are open, and it's going to be an absolute mess. There's a lot of predictions about that. I hope that's not true, but it is very much the case. Wrestling had the same kind of thing, either with drug use or with sexual harassment of things. There's many stories. There's stories about people kind of defecating in bags of female performers as a joke or a rib. There's a lot of exposing themselves in the locker room and so on that goes on. Both industries, wrestling and comic books, has this concept of a locker room leader, or somebody who is kind of seen as an informal authority, not one of the members of the management team, but somebody where they kind of call the shots, and you have to kind of go through them. In wrestling, they would say this people would hold court. So if there's a disagreement in the backstage area with the different wrestlers, you'd see the locker room leader. In many cases, in the WWE, this was a guy like Mark Calloway, The Undertaker, or John Layfield. These are people who typically kind of heard the dispute and would kind of make similar judgments. In comic books, a little bit less like that because it is a decentralized place. You don't have everybody going to the same locker room or building, but you do have cases where people will dispute and bicker, and then it will go to Bendis's attention to kind of resolve the situation, or various people. There's probably better examples of that, but various people over the years that have done this. The other one, though, that I think is probably the most striking to me right now is that in both cases, they're a consumer product company, right? So the WWE, for example, their entire financial health and profit model is built on putting out a product that the customers, that the fans would buy and consume. If they would go to house shows, they would buy tickets, they would buy merchandise, they would subscribe to the channel or the pay-per-views or whatever it happened to be. It was very much a fan-driven business. Comic books is the same way. If the fans are not on board with the storyline or the comic or whatever it is that's being produced, that numbers will drop, and you get real problems in a hurry. And yet, in both cases, there is this disconnect that occurs from time to time between the fans and the management. In the WWE's case, the classic example is Vince McMahon would get in his mind what he thought the fans should see, and to his credit, he was often right. He was able to build $1 billion enterprise for a reason. It's not like he was incompetent at his job, but you did come up with situations where the fans, for example, would really be behind a certain performer. This guy named Daniel Bryan a few years ago that got a lot of attention, people were really excited about, and Vince McMahon was very determined to have a guy named Roman Reigns be the head of the company, win the belt, kind of be in the main event. And the fans would consider, unlike comics, there you have a little bit more immediate kind of fan interaction where you have the fans sitting around the ring, or at least back when they were running shows they did, and the fans would voice their displeasure by booing or jeering. The people would come in or chanting, you suck, or get out, or whatever it is. Very, very direct interaction. Picture comic books where kind of what you see on social media was happening kind of live with every single comic that was produced, which is probably the nightmare for a bunch of creators. But anyway, so you'd see the company pushing people that they felt was best, despite the fact that the feedback they were getting from the fan base was really, really negative. And you'd hear Vince McMahon say things like, well, there's a vocal amount of people who go to shows who boo and kind of do this, but that's not indicative. That's not indicative of the whole audience. We gotta get to a new audience, and we gotta put new faces forward, and that's why we're pushing Roman Reigns. And I think you could make a very, very close analogy to kind of how Marvel has handled the Captain Marvel situation, where the company really wants Captain Marvel to be one of their big characters. So they want her to be right in the front. But rather than take a slower and more organic path to get there, they start saying, all right, well, she is the most popular hero in continuity wise. And her title is, we're going to promote that title. We're going to promote that number one. And we're going to relaunch it as a new number one. We're going to put a lot of emphasis there. somewhat over the objections of the paying customers. And so in that respect, it feels very similar in many cases. In fact, Vince McMahon and many people in wrestling have used the analogy: you give the fans what they need, not what they want, which you hear crop up in comic books all the time as well. The funny part is, and I think it plays true for both comic books and wrestling both. No matter how much you want to push or deny it, you can't rush popularity. I think right now they've got. I haven't watched wrestling regularly in forever, but I still keep up on the results from time to time. And the Roman Reigns, in particular, they're doing something where they've made him a bad guy, and the fans are much more fond of him as a bad guy. It's working much better than when they were trying to push him as the hero of the company. And so usually, these things tend to work out over time as long as you get, that sounds like the opposite of what they say, as long as you give the fans enough of what they want that they can get on board with your idea. And I think Captain Marvel, for example, as a character for Marvel, can work out just fine as long as you get the right angle, the right story, the right kind of mix for that character to go over. But you can't do it just by telling the fans, the customers. You can't just tell them, this is what's important. This is what you're going to cheer for. This is the hero. This is the most important thing. You follow that. It just doesn't work. And I think you see a lot of similarities in both companies where that's concerned. The other one, the more disgusting part of it is the treatment of the independent contractors and the performers often feels very similar too, where the WWE, it's like, as long as you are working and showing up to the house show and, putting it out there, beating up your body, all the rest, then you get a paycheck and they'll do things for you. But the second you start to be of less value, maybe you get that concussion, you break that arm, you start to point out that you like better health insurance, whatever happens to be, they drop you immediately in favor of somebody else. And unfortunately, as much as customers and fans like to complain about, the Marvel and DC kind of, pushing people who hate the fans, and you see his dynamic. One thing that is true is that the big comic companies have no issues in dropping a lot of these people almost immediately if they make any noise or they stop feeling like they're not working the way they want them to work. You do not see a lot of loyalty in both cases, and you will see people who are independent contractors in comics with long careers just kind of vanish over a couple of months because they don't fit into whatever the editorial wants their plan to be. And you see something very similar with wrestling. You can see somebody who goes out there and really puts their body on the line, and then it's like, well, you got injured, or you made too much noise, or you said something we didn't like out in the press, and goodbye. And it's like there's very little long term loyalty, and it does exist. I mean, if you're a good company man, company woman, they will continue to. There's not many company women in the WWE, unless we're talking about Stephanie McMahon. At any rate, you just it is that you can get to be a company person, but it often has a lot more to do with placating Vince McMahon or kissing up to the management or kind of going along with whatever they tell you to go along with, as opposed to maybe producing value or being. It's an interesting world, but overall, yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of weird connections and similarities between wrestling and comics, and I think you could probably come up with a million more. And it's just funny. The core of it, which I touched on just briefly before, is that both cases, these are companies who, in theory, are creating products that are meant to be enjoyed, consumed, and grow an audience. And at times, I think both companies really bend over backwards to not do that. Like they go to a lot of trouble sometimes to get in their own way of accomplishing the very simple goal of just getting comics out the door. So it is an interesting world, and I don't know. So I'm curious now, for the people who are listening to this, anybody who happens to enjoy wrestling, happens to enjoy comics, what do you think? I'm sure I've missed some, but what do you think? Is there a case to be made here? Am I crazy? But let me know your thoughts on this whole thing. I do think if you happen to know enough about wrestling and kind of how the business works and the kind of the backstage and kind of some of the weird dynamics that go on and everything else, and why it's not as simple as just giving, one particular match. It's like, well, people like Shawn Michaels. Why can't we just have Shawn Michaels come out and do a main event every night? It's like, well, his body's kind of broken down and he can't. And I know there's been some fans who just do not understand that. They're like, I pump him up with some steroids and get him back out there. It's like, well, it's not quite how it works. I always think in the back of my head that feels a little bit like when people say, can't we just get George Perez to be the Avengers artist, like, and ship it every 2 weeks? It's like, well, George Perez does not have the ability to pump out a comic, a full page comic every 2 weeks. He does not. So anyway, but I've had big arguments with people like, if they paid him enough, if they just gave enough money, he'd do it. It's like, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but it's not, there are things other than money that get in the way of these things. Anyway, let me know your thoughts, your comments, particularly if you do enjoy both fields. Do you think there's a connection here or not? Curious what you think. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications. Most importantly, as always, thanks for listening.